Thank you everybody for participating. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Some of you are from international participating in this. With pleasure, I want to introduce Mike Grady. He's a painter, writer, and educator. He has taught art at the college level for over 40 years and has a special interest in Asian art, philosophy, and spirituality. He was the dean of the students at the San Francisco Art Institute before he was hired to be the chair of the Department of Arts and Consciousness at John F. Kennedy University. We were elated when he came on board of our faculty. I was a faculty member too, and as he was really a force of nature. And anyone who could develop an MFA program at our university, it was Mike Grady. We immediately became friends and supportive of each other as he was developing the MFA program. I was developing Dream Studies program. Two programs never existed at our university. So we became each other's visionary pal and very good friends. So I'm really delighted he's here. He was on the advisory board of the Lucid Art Foundation and was one of the developers of the international MFA program at the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou in China. Mike is currently a professor of studio art at Appalachian State University. And we're delighted to have Mike Grady here to give us this presentation on arts and consciousness. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Fariba. I'm really very happy to be here. When you first invited me to do this lecture, I was, of course, really flattered and delighted. But when the topic of the history of arts and consciousness came up, I wasn't really sure whether we were talking about the history of the Department of Arts and Consciousness or not. And probably I could have done an hour just talking about all of the great times we had at JFK as the program was developing. Arts and consciousness had been around since 1977, I think. And I arrived in 1994, we just clarified, 1994, and took it on like it was the greatest gift I had ever had. In fact, I had a dream right after I moved to the Bay Area that I won the lottery and bought the ticket in a little cafe in Orinda, California. And I found the cafe, it really was there. And they didn't sell lottery tickets. One of our students, Sahra Al-Mufti, who had many precognitive dreams, laughed and she said, well, that you did win the lottery. You got to be the chair of this department. And I think that was accurate. So we were fortunate to have those years at JFK, first in Orinda and then in the Berkeley campus, to develop a program which is, as far as I know, entirely unique, dedicated to the idea of art, not as a commercial activity, but instead as a way of sort of finding self-affirmation. Looking around the audience, probably a quarter of you are former ANC people in one shape or another, some faculty, some students, hangers-on, whatever. It's wonderful to see everyone here. And I'm looking forward to talking not about the history of the Arts and Consciousness Department, but a real investigation of how consciousness, and that's a really weird word, gets used in relationship to art. I'm very happy that during the years we were at Arts and Consciousness, we functioned as a great community. It wasn't just one person coming up with great ideas, it was everybody coming up with great ideas. And one of those ideas is that art is a way of understanding one's relationship to the community, to the cosmos, to the culture. Art is a way of connecting. And that's what I'm really going to talk about. The self-conscious activity of humans in the discovery of art as their connection to place. One of the most important aspects of that is the idea that art making only became about making pictures fairly recently. The idea, even when we were making pictorial art, is that we were creating a sacred space. So art, even when you make a picture of something on a piece of cardboard, doesn't just make an image, it makes a space. So the ability to create a sacred space through art has been probably the longest standing activity of humankind. So I'm going to go to share screen and do my little dog and pony show. Okay, here's the dog and pony show. I have to move my toolbar to get things working properly. Okay, here we go. The history of arts and consciousness. There's a sense of discomfort in talking about the history of consciousness. It's talking about something that can't be discussed in, a semester or a year. To imagine that we can talk about the history of art and consciousness in an hour or less is kind of a funny idea. So we're going to basically just touch bases to talk about the most salient ideas of this topic, rather grandiose and big. So this is just basically an investigation of spiritual awareness and expression. And the thing that I came up with initially as an alternative title was this: Adventures in Paradox, which is what we're all doing. We're creating new kinds of realities with our art. We transform everything. We transform ourselves, we transform our viewers, our friends, our enemies. Everything changes because of art, because art visualizes a new reality. It is a liminal space. It reconciles the paradox of inner and outer, of dual and non-dual. The body becomes spirit. The personal becomes universal. And the journey becomes the destination. Having spent my entire life as an artist in one form or another, I've understood that being an artist is a way of becoming a broader consciousness, a wider range of knowledge and a range of experiences. It is the architecture beyond space and time. So we go back to the dawn of human consciousness, to Paleolithic art. Every art history lecture always starts with the classic Paleolithic images from Europe, but it's very rare to discuss them in terms of consciousness. We imagine somehow that people went into caves and they made pictures of animals, or they made mysterious pictures, the classic image of the man with the bird's head being apparently gored by a buffalo of some kind. It's wonderfully enigmatic. We have no idea who made these images, what they meant, but as fellow human beings, we understand the nature of consciousness. We've discovered over 1,000 of these small images, collectively, mistakenly, I think, referred to as Venus figures. This is the famous Venus of Willendorf. Best guess is that she had nothing to do with love, but instead came from a time when the female form was seen as connected to the passage of the seasons, the moon, the stars, the sun. Everything was dependent upon the female form. Remember, almost every culture on the planet started with a creation myth that was not about men. It wasn't God created man. It was we came from the mother. So these early images, going back to about 38,000 BC, really are enigmatic. No one knows for certain what they were really used for, other than the tantalizing clues that people tend not to spend a lot of time talking about. The fact that they all seem voluptuous. They have big butts, big breasts, but no head and no feet. So the speculation was that these figures, instead of being goddesses or fertility figures, or people even suggested that they were dildos or pornographic images of some kind. And in fact, all of those theories don't allow for the fact that they have a knob for a head and no feet. The idea that they were used initially as calendar markers is probably most significant. Here, a carving atypical of the Venus figures, the Venus of, or the woman of Lucid, is shown here holding a cornucopia, which we assume signifies abundance, but it has 13 little marks on it. 13, the unlucky number, was actually the magical number of the goddess era, when tribal cultures were the dominant cultural form. Almost all of them worship the number 13 because it's the number of menstrual cycles in a given year. Every woman on the planet has 13 periods in a year. And if you're stuck in a cave during the Ice Age, it becomes very important to know when the sun is going to come out again. When are the buffalo going to be back? When do the salmon run? So the idea was that the menstrual cycles became predictors of the future, was core to the idea of art. Here's a detail of the Venus of Lucid with her 13 little hash marks. The idea of Arthur Corwin, who taught a wonderful course at Cooper Union in New York called Prehistoric Mathematics, was that these Venus figures, so-called, were basically used in conjunction with tapered antlers, of which we found relatively few, but these exquisitely carved reindeer antlers, when tapered, create a perfect circle in soft sand when they're rolled, and that images carved into the bone print into the sand. The idea, Corwin's idea, was that these calendar markers, these Venus figures, were used to advance around the circle with each menstrual cycle. So you'd know what month it was. They were the original calendar girls. The Ishang bones from Africa correspond to the stone cave paintings and images that suggest that the tapered antler, the tapered cylinder, was a really important part of predicting the future, making a circle. The idea of a circle becomes absolutely central to understanding the relationship of art and consciousness. The city of Çatalhöyük, the oldest, supposedly the oldest city that we know of in Turkey, started around 7000 BC. And here we see the evolution of the women of Willendorf, the Venus figures, into sedentary figures. They still don't have much of a head. They've still got large, conspicuously displayed genitalia, breasts, but here still no feet, but sitting aside, different anthropologists have different interpretations, possibly lions, possibly goats, possibly sheep, possibly dogs. We don't know what kind of animals these are exactly, but we know that this signifies that the woman of Willendorf, the Venus figures, were still around when Europeans began to create, quote, civilization. It wasn't just the Europeans. In the Indus Valley, there was a civilization that goes back probably to the origins of Çatalhöyük, around 7,000 or 8,000 BC. We know it as the culture of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. And this culture too had actually very advanced cities. They had multiple story dwellings, a water system, and they were extinct by 1800 BC. This is one of their figures. And again, there were no big artworks. They were small, intimate images of what we take to be a mother goddess, not a sex figure. The Cycladic culture of the Eastern Mediterranean, also possibly independently of any other culture, developed images which were curiously similar to those of other cultures. Again, a Parcheesi marker head, breasts to signify gender, a vague reference to the female genital system. This could symbolize, it's been speculated, the female genital system of the womb with the fallopian tubes and the ovaries. But again, it has no feet. It was clearly intended to be put into the earth. The other thing that becomes a universal signifier of human consciousness is our hand. And again, in cave paintings all over the world, we have images of people's hands. Anthropologists have determined that about half of the hands we found from the Paleolithic era belonged to women, the other to men. So it was an egalitarian activity of putting your hand on the wall, blowing a mixture of soot or ochre and water onto your hand and printing it. It's been speculated that this was a kind of signature, but that's kind of a 20th century interpretation. This signature probably was part of it, but in fact, these handprints were most often used in conjunction with images painted on the sides of walls. And I suspect, as an artist, it's not a question of signing the artwork. Not that many people saw these artworks in any case. This was a way of connecting to our dreams. We would dream an image and connect to it by putting our hand literally on our dream. Part of that process of dreaming our art, of visioning an alternative reality, was captured in thousands, literally thousands of figures, mysterious figures. Sometimes people have imagined that these were extraterrestrials, that they were demonic images. There are all kinds of explanations, but we know that people from the Paleolithic era had wonderful imaginations. They made these amazing creatures that our friend Gordon Onslow Ford would have said came from the inner worlds, not from the outer worlds. The advantage of looking at especially the petroglyphs from the Australian Aboriginal culture is that we can actually talk to people who remember hearing the legends. The Aboriginal people of Australia have probably been living there for 60,000 years. And we can look as foreigners, as outsiders at these cave paintings and imagine what they might have meant. But in the Australian Aboriginal culture, there are people who, through stories that were passed down orally from generation to generation, have some idea of what these images represent. They represent an ongoing tradition. Here, an Australian artist with an artwork that borrows from Australian tradition, but it's very contemporary, but it still uses handprints. A friend of mine was working with an Australian artist, a shaman, who was also a visual artist. And as they were looking at some petroglyphs, the Aboriginal person began to repair some damage done to this petroglyph that was, in that case, probably 7,000 or 8,000 years old. My friend, a European Australian, said, "Hey, you can't do that. You're defacing, a great artwork." And he said, "Well, it's our artwork. It's part of our tradition. So of course I can fix it. Don't be silly. It's not separate from who we are." That idea of community art and transformation really becomes part of what we call shamanism. It's a widely used term, but it has universal applicability to almost all tribal cultures. Before we became civilized, our artists were our shamans. They were the ones in the group who routinely took journeys into the inner worlds. They were unique in their communities for their ability to heal, to call animals, to transform, to actually evolve into an animal. They were shapeshifters. They were magic practitioners. They were artists. Shamanism is the origin of almost every culture on the planet. The ability through art and through ritual and through meditative practice, sometimes through the use of drugs, the idea of almost every culture on the planet starts with shamanism, the ability to shift from a human into an animal. The idea of gaining spiritual knowledge from direct experience is something that's largely been supplanted by formalized religion, and to which we are now, as a culture, now a worldwide culture, returning to as a practice of contemporary art. It's no longer based on faith. It's no longer based on dogma. For us, spiritual knowledge, again, comes from that direct shamanic experience. We look back to the ancient Paleolithic petroglyphs, and we find images that allow for us to understand that people who made these things 15,000 years ago had a vision of themselves, humans turning into animals. It's a common idea. We go back, the earliest image of that kind is called the sorcerer at Trois Frères, a cave in France. But we see images of human animals all through world culture. Every culture has this ability to transform the human figure into an animal figure. Think about Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse may have been a shamanic image, the head of a human and the body of a mouse, or the face of a mouse. The lion man, a lion's head and a human's body, goes back to 18,000 BC. Even the Sphinx, one of the best known cultural artifacts. Think about it. What is a Sphinx? It's got the body of a lion and the head of a person. And it's been defaced and eroded over thousands of years. But it's very clear that Egyptian culture, one of the oldest cultures on the planet, started out as a shamanic culture, a famous papyrus that shows the theology of ancient Egypt, basically shows the messengers of the god, Horus, Osiris, or Ptah, various servants of Osiris, the over god, who have the heads of animals and the bodies of humans. It's a well-documented part of Egyptian culture. The great thing about the Egyptians was that they could write about it. The transformation between the human world, the world of time and space, into the dream world was not unique to any culture. It's widely spread. In ancient Assyrian culture, the head of a bird, winged animals, the body of a horse, the head of a human, and the wings of a bird signify transformation. The Indus Valley culture, again, another enigma, had a written language. We know the written language, the characters at the top of this image say something, but nobody yet has ever been able to decipher it. I was challenged as an undergraduate at Tufts that my instructor came and told us all about this Indus Valley culture and said, if you want to make a name for yourself, just go out and decipher the language of the Indus Valley culture. And people have been trying for 100 years, ever since they discovered the ruins of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, to figure out what these seals, they have hundreds of seals of images, but the most enigmatic thing about the seals is the images. Here we see something from around 4,000 years ago with the head of an animal, but it seems to be sitting in the lotus position. There's endless speculation that yoga itself, the Indian tradition of yoga, goes all the way back to the Indus Valley culture. And that transcendence has to do with having a head with animal characteristics and being surrounded by not only written words, but animal images. Remarkable, in the 5th century, the shamanic culture of the Celts in Western Europe had amazingly similar images. To our knowledge, there was no connection between the Indus Valley culture of what is now Pakistan and the shamanic cultures of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Europe. But we have this great Celtic god, Cernunnos, who has the head of an animal, actually antlers, surrounded by animals, and clearly signifies the ability to transform his physical form from human into animal. It's a form that's replicated even today. The image on the right is a shaman from the Sami culture in northern Scandinavia. An image next to him, is an image of someone doing exactly the same ritual over 100 years ago, an etching from the mid-1800s. India, everybody is familiar with, this is one of the most popular images in Indian culture, Ganesha, the son of Shiva and Parvati, signifies abundance, wealth, prosperity, play, fun, sometimes dirty jokes, sometimes a trickster, but still a shamanic reference, the head of an elephant and the body of a slightly overwhite human. The Greeks, of course, had centaurs, the body of horses, the heads and torsos of humans, which became a really rich part of European classical mythology and culture. The Minotaur, this evil adversary seen with the head of a bull and the body of a human, was one of the great images of the archetype of the dark foe, the other, the person that had to be overcome. Hercules fights with the Minotaur as one of his tests of divinity. The winged Nike of Samothrace. We think of this as part of Greek and Roman culture, but think about it. Why does this woman have wings? It has to have originated in some earlier form that shows wings as a signifier of shamanic experience. In the Micmac culture of Siberia, shamanism is still practiced widely. This is a mask made in the late 1800s of a Micmac shaman. And what happened when he died is they actually cut his face off, tanned it like a piece of leather, preserving his facial tattoos and fixing it to a lattice work, a little wicker mask form, so that subsequent shamans could wear this mask and assume some of the shamanic power of the great shaman who had been deceased. There are dozens of masks of this kind still used all through the Micmac culture and occasionally in different forms in Pacific Northwest Native American culture. The Maori of New Zealand still practice a kind of shamanism. This is a Maori shaman, a Maori leader called a Kwea. And it shows this guy, he's not being rude. He's basically doing part of a celebration, a ritual called haka, which is an invocation, kind of a fierce and very warrior-like tradition of invoking spirits to transform reality. It's done routinely in New Zealand at the beginning of art openings, parties. People often just spontaneously do one of these hakas to commemorate and celebrate Maori culture, which is still amazingly intact after years of colonialism. We look for geometric archetypes, the shapes of universal meaning. Carl Jung said that archetypes, whether they're geometric or cultural, become the psychic equivalent of an instinct. They are things that automatically assume meaning or imbue an image with meaning. The Vitruvian Man of Leonardo da Vinci on the left shows an anthropocentric view of the world, with the circle, the square, the triangle, the cross, all becoming signifiers not just of universal consciousness, but of the human form in relation to universal consciousness. The great circle is still an essential part of shamanism. Fariba, you're an experienced researcher into various aspects of shamanism, and the drum as the circle becomes a primary tool for the alteration of consciousness. Here's the Miranda people of Australia make circular wheels that are used for altering consciousness, for moving from walkabout time, the time of time and space, to dream time, the time of creation. The rainbow serpent from which everything evolved came out of dream time, where time doesn't move in a straight line, it moves like a serpent. It moves in an undulating, ever-changing way. And that we as humans have the ability through shamanic practice and through art to transform from dream time into real time or literal time, time-space, and then back to dream time again. It's what we do. The sacred circle becomes an artifact of every culture on the planet. It's not a coincidence. It's not something that was borrowed from one culture to the other. It's something that's innately understood by human consciousness. The shaman's drum, here a Native American, a Lakota drum, is a sacred circle. Sometimes it's called a medicine wheel. Here, a sacred circle from the Kabbalah, from ancient esoteric teachings from Judaism, basically has to do with the circle within the circle within the circle, sometimes connected to other archetypes, but often done as literal spaces, not just pictures but places where one goes to become transformed. At the center of a medicine wheel, our consciousness automatically changes. When the medicine wheel becomes joined to other archetypes, here the wheel becomes part of a square, becomes part of a cross, and the juxtaposition of all of those things creates spiritual transformation. The largest sacred circle on the planet happens 5 times a day, and its center is Mecca. The Kaaba in Saudi Arabia is the center of Islam. 5 times a day, everybody in Islam faces Mecca and bows down. They create a giant circle, a circle that's the size of the earth. The idea of the mandala, or the mandala, as it's sometimes called, is the idea of the paradox of the circle. If we stand inside of a square, we can identify a corner as different from a face, but inside of a circle, we can't define individual details of the circle. The paradox of the squared circle, the paradox of the upturned triangle with the downturned triangle, sometimes associated with the male principle, upturned, the downturned triangle, the female principle. When they're conjoined, as they are on the right hand, we have the Star of David. The interesting thing is that this particular mandala doesn't come from Judaism, it comes from Sufism. It's an Islamic mandala. And the idea of the interpenetrating triangles becomes emblematic of the mandala. It creates the visual paradox of the squared circle. It becomes literally a device for meditation, a tool for transformation. Universal presence of mandalas is taken for granted. Every culture on the planet has a way of aligning these visual archetypes to create paradox. The creation of paradox allows us to have a doorway into a sacred space. Temples, cathedrals, all of the great things of culture emanate from those basic archetypal shapes. In Hinduism, the archetype of the mandala, the circle, the square, the cross, all are internally seen during meditation as corresponding to various points of the body. They become locations, not just pictures, not just a really cool idea or something that turns into a great poster. They literally become part of our bodies. And through meditation, the body is seen as becoming infinite through the meditation of one of these mandalas, in this case corresponding to each of the 7 chakras. Sacred architecture has always been built on this idea of the mandala, the medicine wheel that we saw. The mandalas all contain the sacred circle in which transformation can occur. Here, the floor plan for the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul becomes one of the earliest European Christian artifacts for creating transformation of consciousness. Here it's shown with the minarets that were added after Islam took over Istanbul, Constantinople, and converted the Hagia Sophia from a Christian cathedral into an Islamic mosque. But they understood the sacredness of this structure, the circle inside of the square, inside of the circle, inside of the square. In the Romanesque era of European history, we began to build Christian cathedrals in the form of a cross. At the center of the cross, where the x-axis and the y-axis meet, x and y, here opposites, in the center become identical. That's the place where Christian cathedrals chose to administer the Holy Sacrament of Transubstantiation, the Eucharist. Basically, you drink wine and eat bread, which here is just a nice poetic metaphor for body and blood. But in the center of the cross, maybe bread becomes flesh, maybe wine becomes blood, and there we ascend up. So it's a multidimensional mandala, a meditation machine. Notre Dame de Paris, the Gothic cathedrals were all based on the idea of creating gigantic amplifiers for human consciousness, multimedia installations that were specifically engineered to alter human consciousness. The Rose Cathedral, basically omnipresent in Gothic cathedrals, is exactly a mandala. In the Navajo culture of the American Southwest, they have, long before they had any contact with the Europeans, made sand paintings, paintings just on the floor of hogans, sacred structures, again, creating a location, not making a picture. Now they're sold in roadside tourist traps for, for $50, you can get a sand painting. But the origins of the sand paintings are deeply rooted in the culture, in the location, in the earth itself. 10,000 miles away, well, 7,000 miles away from the Navajo, another culture uses sand to make sacred circles. The Tibetans, this is a Tibetan sand mandala. And monks spend weeks sometimes making these elaborate, this is 8 feet wide, out of colored sand. At the end of the meditation, the creation and the meditation being the same thing, after the mandala has been completed, the monks pick up a broom and sweep it up. They've spent hours and hours making every detail perfect, and they sweep it up and throw away the sand because we shouldn't be attached to our works. So the idea of making pictures of mysticism, it seems impossible. How can you give form to the formless? We look at a tradition of religious art, and we see that those archetypes, the cross, the circle, the square, are now applied to the human form. Early Christian art, based on Roman representational painting, creates not only sacred images, but icons. Images in Buddhism use the sacred circle in a very carefully prescribed manner to depict the Buddha. This isn't supposed to be a picture of Buddha. This is an emanation of the Buddha. It is the Buddha itself. Devout Christians, especially from the Eastern Orthodox traditions, don't believe that this is a picture of Jesus. This is his spiritual presence, the essence of the spiritual power of a great figure. The use of the archetypes, the upturned triangle, suggesting that this is Christ dying for our sins, an image of Christ which doesn't really appear in Christian art until about 1,000 years after Christ was crucified. But the idea of the cross is a signifier of the duality of humanity and divinity is here beautifully replicated. Going upwards, we see a tree growing out of the cross, and here a bird representing the Holy Spirit. So it uses the architecture of the mandala, but it creates an image which is designed for us to understand the basic teachings of Christianity. The Virgin of Vladimir is a classic image. Nobody loves this image because it's such a good drawing of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Virgin Mary looks like she's a cartoon, and the baby Jesus looks kind of like an otter. I mean, no attempt at verisimilitude, at making a realistic image, but people hold this as a sacred presence. It's standing in front of the icon, is seen by many people who use the tradition of devotion and faith as a way of standing literally in the presence of the divine. The Renaissance was about the secularization of Europe. We became very much more interested in ourselves than interested in the idea of transcendence. Botticelli's great masterpiece, The Birth of Venus, is actually related to that tradition that goes back to the woman of Willendorf, the goddess tradition, the image of the woman symbolizing beauty, but also embodying a link between the human form and the passage of the seasons. Here, it's not a coincidence that Botticelli's made a beautiful woman who's standing in the presence of the 4 seasons. Here, winter and spring intertwined, and she's emerging as a mediator between the seasons. Mother Nature herself is cloaking her in a garment but it's basically that innate concept of the divine feminine. The three graces here done by Raphael show the sort of soft warmth, the divinity of the human form as an intermediary for artists. If we make art, the ancient Greeks and Romans, and by association, the Renaissance artists, believed that it was a divine inspiration that allowed art to occur. The muses, or the three graces, were the intermediaries between the world of the gods and the world of people. The only way that we make art is through the grace of God. The graces are the personification, the anthropomorphization of the intermediary between heaven and earth. One of the first great visionary artists of Europe, we don't know much about. His name was Hieronymus Bosch, and his great painting, everyone knows, it's in the Prado in Spain, really is seen by most art historians as really about Christian faith. On the left, standing in the Garden of Eden with God, Adam and Eve are cast out into this world of sin and deprivation, and the penalty for sin and deprivation is that you have to live in hell. Well, there's an alternative suggestion about this image, which is based on the clue left behind by Hieronymus Bosch. These little circles with chimneys coming out of the top were seen by art historians for many years as just fantastical, imaginative objects that Bosch created. We now understand that they were marriage chambers. They were beakers through which alchemical processes were first enacted. The subtext of this painting is actually water, the whole basis of alchemy, which Hieronymus Bosch must have been a participant in to have made these paintings, suggests that this is really not the world of sin and deprivation. It may have been the world of joy and celebrating life, and that the extreme faith in the presence of an anthropomorphic God in a perfect world is counterbalanced by hell, which actually looks very much like Europe must have looked around 1505. The hell in the background is probably one of the most common sights of 16th century Europe during the Inquisition, during the Reformation. War after war after war, persecutions of heretics, witches. It was a madness. And Bosch has cleverly built his own picture, his own self-portrait, the only one we know of, is built into his vision of hell. So this was not just the act of a clever artist who's making pictures of his imagination. He's literally creating a reality. And he's saying, of these three realities, this is the one that most reflects the world as we know it. This is the world as we believe it to be, as we would like it to be. And on the left, as it was once provided. Wonderfully ambivalent or ambiguous statement about human consciousness. From right around the same time, the great Isenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald is fascinating because it shows the article of faith, Christ on the cross, with an altar that is then opened up with great ritual, sound, chanting, incense. It approaches all of the senses. It's done at a time when Europe was experiencing one of its greatest plagues. And the detail of Christ on the cross shows, if you look closely, that his body is covered with buboes. He's literally dying of the plague, just like you, just like me. We look at this image of Christ feeling the pain of our own suffering, opening up and eventually becoming the fulfillment of Christianity, which is to ascend to God the Father, and here to literally turn into a circle of light. What Grunewald did in this painting probably was impossible to do prior to the development of oil paint, but that is to depict the dissolution of form into light, which becomes a metaphor for human transformation. Here, Francisco Zurbarán did a series of paintings of Saint Francis of Assisi in religious ecstasy, as a student, I went over to the Boston Museum and looked at one of these great images of St. Francis and just had an absolutely profound sense of resonance with the religious ecstasy, the transformation of this great bodhisattva, this great spiritual practitioner holding the skull, the memento mori, and in doing that, transcending even our own mortality. The sacred circle takes on different significance in Zen Buddhism. This is an enzo, an image, basically the logo of Zen Buddhism, along with the spiral. The one-stroke Bodhidharma by Nobutada basically is a classic Zen Buddhist explanation of depicting the infinite. And with this one stroke depicting the patriarch of Zen Buddhism, we have calligraphy that says, pointing directly to the human heart, see your own nature and become Buddha. Well, if that ain't art and consciousness, I don't know what is. Mu Qi, a great Zen master from the Sung dynasty of China, did this very small painting of 6 persimmons. And the greatest accolade that was accorded to it is that it becomes quietly tumultuous. This tiny little ink rendering of 6 pieces of fruit becomes an absolutely perfect statement of difference, of ecstasy, of transformation. Again, a brilliant idea of transcending our own sense of reason and achieving something that exists beyond the world of time, space, and volume, beyond the world of reason, and entering the inner worlds. A much later image of Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen Buddhism, who brought Chan Buddhism or Dhyana Buddhism from India to China in the 5th century. Here is shown by the great Japanese woodblock master Yoshitoshi, and it's one of my favorite images of Bodhidharma. He looks like a comic strip character. In fact, it was Yoshitoshi who created the genre, which later became the comic book. But here, this great Zen master is shown. It looks to me very much like he's got a joint in his mouth, but I'm sure that wasn't the case. I've never read an explanation of why there's a little white shape coming out of his beard, but I wouldn't put it past him. This was, though, the image of Zen secularized and transported to the West, where woodblock prints had a profound impact on the world of European modernism. The Zen monk Shidao here did a painting in the 16th century, 15th century. It should have been the 16th century. It was 1597, I think. Did this image of himself sitting in a mountain retreat with a style of painting that looks like it might have come out of New York in the 1960s. Zen becomes a style like the others of transforming human consciousness by subverting all of the principles of reason and order. The idea of the Chinese garden is exemplified by the koi swimming in below this lantern, this moon lantern. The koi actually aren't just pretty fish that you can admire. If you stand by the pond and watch the koi swim, you see that they move in a kind of smoke-like motion, an undulating serpentine flow that perfectly captures the essence of most Asian traditions, which is flow, the idea of the Tao. The great exemplars of spiritual practice in Chinese tradition are called the literati, or the Wenren. They basically became the center of Chinese art culture starting around the 12th century, but really reaching their peak after China was taken over by the Mongols, and the great artists who were also the great leaders of China, the great administrators of China, were forced to live in the wilderness, where they spent their lives just cultivating their own awareness of nature and spirituality. There were 4 principles that defined the literati tradition. Qi Yun, which is the spirit resonance; mystery, Xuan; the idea of intention, novelty, flow, liu, water, ink, clouds, the idea that nothing stands still, and detachment, the spirit of the recluse. The great contribution of the literati to the world of arts and consciousness was they taught us that we aren't really all that important. We are the tiny little dots here in this painting that show our relation to the flow of nature. A large painting, one of the great classics of Chinese art, Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, shows that we need to really interact with nature to understand anything, to understand beauty, to understand truth. The great artist Guo Xi did this anthem of nature mysticism in the 11th century by wandering around in the mountains, sometimes for months, coming back to his studio and letting his body remember the reality of those wanderings in the mountains. Autumn Colors in the Chao and Hua Mountains by Zhao Mingfu, a generation later, shows a very austere way of making the landscape. And what happened after the literati tradition really took full form is that these great works of art were not sold. They didn't decorate rich people's houses. They were transferred from one artist to another, from one scholar to another. And with the transfer of each owner of this image, an additional seal was added to this painting. And in many cases, once you came into contact with this painting that became your property, you would add to the artist's original calligraphy, to his poem that describes this, and you would add your own poem. So the idea of acquiring a great masterpiece, and instead of holding it as a treasure, literally participating with it, becomes a radical notion. We don't really have any counterpart of that in the West, but the idea of the literati painting as an ongoing dialogue of people talking about their relation to art, nature, poetry, calligraphy, and the flow of the Tao becomes one of the most effective forms of transformative consciousness that we know of, and creates artworks that last hundreds of years. Six Gentlemen by Nizan, classic literati art. Dong Xichang from the Ming Dynasty, the 16th century. To be an artist, you must walk 10,000 miles and read 10,000 books. It connects to around the same time in Europe, where we were beginning to become aware of nature in a different way. On the left, we see a painting by Shen Zhou, a Ming Dynasty Chinese literati painter, who does a wonderful image of himself standing on a mountaintop, standing apart and writing a little poem about how the artist must stand apart from the flow of nature. About 200 years later, the German Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich did his image of the wanderer, a man standing with his back to the viewer, looking out over this sublime landscape. The idea of the sublime, the idea of nature as being so beautiful that it becomes terrifying, is the new way of describing the experience of art as a mediation of the divine. The search for essence, deeper meaning, becomes part of the European tradition of finding meaning not in religion, but in direct experience. The idea of non-religious spiritual experience, having an experience directly with nature, becomes part of the Reformation. It was one of the things the Protestants critiqued Roman Catholicism on, but it also became the measure of human consciousness. Nature mysticism, finding the mystical connection of the universe in direct experience. Joseph Turner, this weird guy down at the bottom, once had this great quote. He said, of all the uninteresting genres of painting, landscape is the most uninteresting. It becomes interesting only when the artist forgets the details of nature and looking beyond them discovers himself. And the whole tradition of landscape painting and the sublime becomes really an inexorable part of the experience of art and consciousness. Turner's image of the wreck of the Minotaur shows his very rational and romantic idea of painting a storm at sea, which he saw as the ultimate expression of the sublime. Years later, he had himself tied to the mast of a ship as he was returning to England from a sketching tour of Europe, and he endured 5 hours of being tied to the mast of the ship like Ulysses, hearing the sound of the sirens. In his case, it was a snowstorm. He was nearly killed in the act of doing this. He had pneumonia. People have argued that he actually died some years later of complications from the pneumonia he incurred before doing this painting. When he recovered partially from his pneumonia, he did this painting, which is, if any expression I've ever seen of art and consciousness, the sublime connection of beauty, terror, and the mystical connection of humans to natural forces, that's it. Turner spent his life trying to do what Isenheim's altarpiece had done. Matthias Grunewald dissolved form into light. Turner did it routinely. It became one of the hallmarks of European art in the 19th and 20th centuries. I think one of my favorite Turner paintings is this. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and it's a sea monster. He thought art was not supposed to be sanctimonious. It wasn't about sacred art. It was about having a good time. It was about being connected. During his lifetime, people said that his work looked like whitewash and soap suds. His response is, well, what do you think the middle of the ocean looks like? His work had a profound, although often denied, connection on the development of modern art in Europe, specifically the Impressionists. Claude Monet took the Turner idea of dissolving form into light and dissolved everything into color. The idea of connecting color and light becomes a sacred quest. Monet's Nymphes, his water lilies series, basically, for the first time, really gets to the idea that art becomes an object, it becomes a place, it becomes a search for essence and hidden meaning, finding the thing behind the thing. It wasn't about making a picture of water lilies. Monet's Nymphes was really about creating a place in which we become infinite. The modern sublime, after the idea of this reverent sense of nature, becomes humor, becomes irony, becomes satire. The heroic gesture, the idea of making a mark, becomes an act of spiritual attainment. The fine disregard, breaking all of the rules with a fine disregard for the rules of the game, it was ascribed to young William Webb Ellis, a student at the rugby school in England, who one day, just for the hell of it, decided to take the game of football, turn it on its ear, and created an entirely new game just because he wanted to break the rules. They call the game rugby after the school where he was enrolled. Albert Einstein, probably the best exponent of modernism, said creativity is intelligence having fun. Gauguin went to Tahiti and made this epic painting that for the first time asks questions instead of giving answers. Matisse celebrates luxury, tranquility, and pleasure as part of Fauvism, a new form of spirituality as pure physical enjoyment, the delight of the bonheur, the good time. Images that were seen as ridiculous, as frivolous, as not really spiritual. How can you have spirituality if it's all about carnal pleasure? It was a revocation, breaking the rules with a fine disregard. He was breaking the rules of Christianity. He was breaking the rules of Puritanism. He was breaking the rules of European order and celebrating his own existence. Picasso, his great friend and rival, made the breakthrough piece, Demoiselles d'Avignon, as a way of breaking the rules. German Expressionism invoked for the first time the teachings of theosophy. Asian mysticism sort of detoured through Russia and became the hallmark of a new genre of art. We called it the Blue Rider School. The Blaue Reiter, led by Vasily Kandinsky from Russia, came to Germany and for the first time developed the idea of art that wasn't a picture. non-pictorial art, not a picture of something, but a something. Johannes Itten applied the rules of theosophy and other esoteric practices with color and developed his theory of color, which is still used today, ascribed often to Joseph Albers, but invented by the head of the foundation program at the Bauhaus in 1919. Johannes Itten thought that color was itself an emanation of altered consciousness. Hilma af Klint, a Swedish artist who was discovered by Kandinsky and other early modernist abstractionists, basically made images based on voices that she heard. Her artwork, which became absolutely stunning abstract art at a time when no one else was making abstract art, was purely the result of her own altered states of consciousness, going to a different level of her own inner worlds and experimenting with a new form of art and consciousness. Surrealism, developed by André Breton, the guy sitting at the center, takes the idea of Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxist communist ideology and combines it with the modernist impulse towards frivolity and breaking the rules. And here shows an image of all of the surrealists at the time this was shot, standing around an image made by René Magritte, excuse me, Je ne vois pas le cachet dans la forêt. I don't see the hiding place in the forest. A wonderful pun on you can't see the forest for the trees. Playing with humor, playing with the unconscious became the hallmark of surrealism. Magritte did this image for the wonderful movie Being There with Peter Sellers in 1964. The Son of Man becomes an entirely symbolic form of expression of human consciousness. André Masson, 42, was one of the surrealists who developed the whole practice of psychic automatism, the idea of letting the painting paint itself, getting out of the way, and in so doing, connecting to our own collective unconscious. Juan Miró, an early automatist. Roberto Mata came from Chile to Paris to join the surrealists and became an automatist who was profoundly influential throughout the world, the art world in the 1950s. Our own Gordon Onslow Ford joined the surrealist movement in 1938 and became an early practitioner of psychic automatism that eventually led, along with artists like Wolfgang Paulin, to artwork that first influenced the French art informel, the lyrical abstractionist movement, and eventually here Zhao Wuqi became a sort of descendant of psychic automatism in the years after World War II. Joan Mitchell basically becomes an abstract expressionist in New York who spends most of her life actually living in Paris. But it was Mark Tobey who took the teachings of Zen Buddhism and applied them to automatism. But eventually it was artwork that stemmed from automatism. Here, Gordon's painting from 1960, In Focus, which really inspired the entire generation of abstract expressionists to find a new way of exploring spirituality. They combined the monumentality of Monet's water lilies with an entirely new way of applying automatist art. Here's Convergence, Jackson Pollock. We're running out of time. I saw your hand go up, Ellen. The idea that abstract expressionism started as autonomism for each of the major artists of the abstract expressionist. First, they went through a period of automatism that led to a characteristic style that dominated the art world. Rothko started out with the swirl at the edge of the sea and created artwork that was sublime. He himself, I imagined initially when I saw his work, must have been a highly evolved being, but every image that you see of Rothko shows him looking like he's standing in front of a firing squad. He's always got a cigarette, often has a glass of scotch. He killed himself the year that I went to art school. But before he died, he left legacies of collections of his work to major museums who agreed to show it in a single place. His greatest legacy, I think, is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. If you haven't been there, it's a must-see. It's a place I've made many pilgrimages to. But it's basically the idea that painting is no longer a picture on a wall, it's a place, it's a destination. The entire Rothko Chapel uses these painted images to alter the space. An octagon made of poured concrete designed by Philip Johnson, consecrated by the Dalai Lama, here the founder of the Rothko Chapel, the great patron, Mrs. Manil from a wealthy Houston collector, here is dedicating the creation of the Rothko Chapel with the Dalai Lama. Here, a celebration of Martin Luther King Day. Here, a Christian concert of sacred music. Modern spirituality, postmodern spirituality, all becomes about the idea of moving beyond the limitations of the way we think about art and moving into a more expansive, ever widening idea of space. James Turrell creates the Rodin crater as a meditation machine. It's related to the sacred circles of Paleolithic art, related to the medicine wheel, related to all forms through which shared human experience becomes part of the conversation. Bill Witherspoon, 1,000-foot wide Sri Yantra, a sacred mandala made with bulldozers on the floor of the Oregon desert. It's ridiculous, it's sublime. Ana Mendieta becomes the poster child, the martyr for ecofeminism. The idea that her own body is connected to the universe is a notion that she's inherited from thousands of generations of women. Vijay Hamilton from Marin County travels around the world activating sacred sites as shamanism. Even Beeple, who we think of as being, the exemplary creator of meaningless internet art, when it was auctioned off recently at $69.3 million for something that doesn't even exist, tell me that this isn't a sublime example of form arriving from formlessness. And finally, Lonnie Graham, whose work really exemplifies the idea of art going full circle into a search for authentic identity. Phew, that's the end. Thank you. I'll take questions if there anybody still is awake. Anyone still out there?
Thank you, Mike. It was just unbelievably beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very informative. I was just thinking about when you were talking about earlier on the history, how relevant squaring the circle is for alchemical image of squaring the circle for this time, about harmonizing, how that concept of so many years ago is so relevant for today.
Especially relevant, and especially in the postmodern era, in the age of digitization, we have a tendency to think that the internet is the opposite of spirituality. And I think the opposite is true. In fact, the next lecture I do is going to be about that topic, the idea of postmodern spirituality and the digital Anthropocene.